Right now, somewhere in the world, there's a sea turtle gliding through warm water, slow and ancient, the same way it has moved for 100 million years. It surfaces, breathes, dives, and somewhere on a shoreline, a person who once untangled that exact turtle from a fishing net is going about their day, probably not thinking about it at all. But here's the question that should stop you cold. Does the turtle remember them? Does any animal, when it looks at the human who pulled it back from the edge, feel something it could call recognition, something it could call gratitude? Or do we disappear from their minds the moment we walk away, nothing more than a brief interruption in a life that has no room for us? That question sounds almost too human to ask about an animal, and yet scientists have been asking it with real rigor, real experiments, and findings that are genuinely difficult to explain away. What you're about to hear is not a collection of heartwarming stories dressed up as science. It's something stranger and more unsettling than that. Because the answer isn't simply yes or no. The answer asks you to completely rethink what an animal actually is. Let's start with what memory even means for a non-human mind. For a long time, the scientific consensus was fairly comfortable. Animals have what's called semantic memory, the ability to remember that something exists, a location, a smell, a sound. What they were assumed to lack was episodic memory, the kind of memory that lets you mentally travel back to a specific moment in your past and re-experience it. That kind of memory, the kind that lets you remember a face and a feeling and a context all at once, was considered a human privilege, a gift of language and self-awareness. And then the research started to complicate that story. Nicola Clayton, a comparative psychologist at the University of Cambridge, spent years studying Western scrub jays. And what she found was striking. These birds don't just remember where they hid food. They remember when they hid it, and they adjust their behavior based on how much time has passed, because they know some foods spoil. They plan into the future and revise decisions based on past experience. Clayton described this as mental time travel in non-human animals. Not perfect episodic memory in the human sense, but something that functions remarkably like it. If a jay can remember the what, where, and when of a past event, the question becomes, can other animals do the same for the humans in their lives? If you find yourself genuinely curious about what's happening inside animal minds, about whether the bond you feel with an animal is something they actually experience too, you're exactly where this channel lives. There's a subscribe button nearby, and every video here goes deeper into that question from a different angle. This one is just the beginning. The first obstacle to answering our question is figuring out whether an animal can even recognize itself as a distinct individual. Because recognizing someone else requires, at some level, a sense of self to recognize them from. In 1970, psychologist Gordon Gallup Jr. designed an experiment that became one of the most debated tests in all of animal cognition. He placed a mirror in front of chimpanzees and watched what happened. After a few days of exposure, the chimpanzees began using the mirror to examine parts of their own bodies they couldn't normally see. Then Gallup marked them with an odorless red dye while they were sedated, in a spot only visible in a mirror. When the chimps saw their reflection, they touched the mark on their own bodies, not the glass. They understood the reflection was them. That test, the mirror self-recognition test, has since been passed by great apes, dolphins, Asian elephants, European magpies, and, in some studies, certain fish. These are animals with a self to come back to, and that changes everything. Because here's what self-recognition implies. If an animal knows it exists as a separate being in the world, it can also know that other beings are separate from it. It can build a mental model of another individual. It can track that individual over time. And if it can track a conspecific, a member of its own species, there is real evidence it can also track a human. Franz de Waal, the primatologist and ethologist who spent decades studying social cognition in apes, documented extensively how chimpanzees and bonobos remember specific individuals, their rank, their alliances, their past behavior, sometimes over years of separation. De Waal described primates as beings with rich social memories, and he made the argument, carefully and consistently, that the emotional texture of those memories matters. They don't just remember who did what, they remember how it felt. But here's where it gets strange. You might expect that the animals most capable of this kind of memory would be the ones with the most complex brains. And often that's true, but some of the most viscerally striking evidence for cross-species recognition memory comes from an animal almost no one would expect: crows. In 2011, a research team led by John Marsluff at the University of Washington conducted a study in which researchers wore specific rubber masks while handling and banding wild crows. The crows were then released. Months later, sometimes over a year later, when researchers wore those same masks in areas where the crows lived, the birds dive-bombed them, scolded them, mobbed them. They had remembered a specific face on a creature of a completely different species, and they held on to that memory for an extraordinary length of time. Control masks that had never been involved in the capture were ignored. The crows were not reacting to people in general. They were reacting to specific individuals who had once threatened them. That's not instinct. That's something much closer to personal history. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment. If a crow can remember a specific human face that threatened it more than a year ago, what does that suggest about what an animal might remember of a human who helped it? We tend to assume fear memories are stronger, more durable. And neurologically, that's often true. Fear activates the amygdala intensely. But Duvall's work and others suggest that positive social bonds also leave deep traces. The question is whether a wild animal, returned to the wild after a rescue, carries any trace of that human at all. There are documented cases that are difficult to dismiss. In 2016, marine biologist João Pedro Simoes, working off the coast of Brazil, observed a Magellanic penguin that returned year after year to the same man, João Pereira de Souza, who had nursed it back to health after finding it covered in oil in 2011. The penguin, which the man named Dindim, would spend months with him, then vanish into the ocean to breed, then return. Researchers who studied the case noted that the penguin showed clear preferential behavior toward its rescuer, following him, grooming him, resisting separation. Whether Dindim experienced something we would call gratitude is a question science deliberately avoids answering with certainty. But the behavior itself was consistent, repeated, and directed at one specific person. That demands an explanation. This is a good moment to ask you something directly. Has an animal ever looked at you in a way that made you feel recognized? Not just noticed, but actually seen? Leave that in the comments. Because what researchers are slowly piecing together suggests that what you felt in that moment might not have been imagination. In primates, the evidence goes further. Researchers have documented what can only be described as a sense of social debt in chimpanzees. In studies by Duvall at the Yerkes National Primate Research Center, chimps were more likely to share food with individuals who had groomed them earlier that day. They tracked who had done something for them. They responded with reciprocal behavior. This is called reciprocal altruism. And while the debate over whether it involves conscious awareness is ongoing, what's not debated is the tracking. Something in their cognitive system registers, "This individual helped me," and uses that information later. Now ask yourself, if an animal registers help from within its own species, what happens when the helper is a human? The Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, signed in 2012 by a prominent group of neuroscientists, including Stephen Hawking as a witness, made a statement that still reverberates in science. It concluded that non-human animals possess the neurological substrates that generate consciousness, including all mammals, birds, and even octopuses. This wasn't a fringe position. It was a formal scientific declaration that these animals have the architecture for subjective experience, which means when a rescued animal encounters its rescuer again, there is, at minimum, a real nervous system with real emotional processing responding to that encounter. There is someone home, and this is the part science still can't fully explain. In 2018, a study published in Animal Cognition documented that domestic dogs not only recognize human faces, but respond differently to happy versus angry expressions in strangers and show measurable physiological stress responses to their owner's negative emotions. Their heart rate changes. Their cortisol levels shift. They are not reading a mood and calculating a response. They are feeling the emotional weather of a specific human they are bonded to. The specificity matters. It's not humans in general. It's you. The philosopher Thomas Nagel wrote in his 1974 essay, "What is it like to be a bat?" that we may never fully access the subjective experience of another creature, that there is an inner dimension to animal consciousness that our concepts simply cannot reach. He wasn't arguing that animals have no inner life. He was arguing the opposite, that the inner life of a bat, or any animal, may be so genuinely different from ours that our language fails to contain it. Which means, when we ask, does this animal remember the human who saved it, we might be asking the wrong kind of question. We're trying to fit their experience into our categories. And their categories might be richer, or stranger, or more embodied than anything we have words for. Now we arrive at the moment this whole question was building toward. Because the most extraordinary case of cross-species recognition memory doesn't involve a lab, or a study, or a controlled condition. It involves an orca named Luna. Luna was a young male killer whale, separated from his pod in Nootka Sound, British Columbia, in 2001. He was alone for years in those waters, and during that time he sought out human contact with a persistence that marine biologists found both remarkable and heartbreaking. He approached boats, interacted with fishermen, rubbed against kayaks. He seemed to be filling the void of social connection with the only social beings available to him. People who spent time with him described the experience as unmistakable. He behaved differently with individuals he had encountered before. He returned to specific boats, specific people. He appeared to track individual humans the way his pod would track individual orcas. Luna died in 2006, struck by a boat propeller. But what his case suggested to researchers studying cetacean cognition was that the social memory of orcas, already known to be extraordinarily complex, extends across species lines. They do not see humans as furniture in their environment. They see us as social agents, individuals with histories, with patterns, with identities. And if that's true of orcas, and of crows, and of chimpanzees, and of a penguin returning every year to the same man on a beach in Brazil, then the framework shifts entirely. The question was never really whether animals remember the human who saved them. The question was whether animals see us at all, not as a presence, but as a someone. And the science, the real documented, peer-reviewed, careful science, says yes. They see us. They track us. They feel something in our direction that their nervous systems process the way we process feeling something. The bond you feel when an animal looks at you is not a projection onto a blank screen. It's a meeting. Two subjectivities, shaped by completely different evolutionary histories, finding each other across a gap that shouldn't, by any logical measure, be crossable. And yet, somehow, it is. If this conversation moved something in you, share this video with someone who has ever looked into an animal's eyes and wondered what was looking back. And if you want to go further into that question, into what animals feel, remember, and understand about the strange creatures they live alongside, there's a lot more here. Every video on this channel is built around that same curiosity, that same refusal to accept that we already know what's happening inside those minds, because we don't. And that, more than anything, is worth staying for.